That's not my signature. I said it 3 times before the bank manager finally stopped nodding along politely and actually looked at the document again. 3 times, calm and clear, while my hands were doing something underneath the desk that had nothing to do with calm at all. Ma'am, this resolution transfers your ownership stake to Mr. Alden, effective the 15th. It's notarized. Your signature's right here. I know what it says, I told her. I'm telling you I never signed it. That sentence is the reason you're watching this video, because everything that happened after it is going to rearrange itself in your mind at least twice before this story is over. I promise you that. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the person who did this to me is not who you'll think it is at first, and the reason they did it is going to be even further from what you'd guess. If you love a story that keeps folding back on itself, subscribe now. This channel exists for exactly this feeling. And tell me in the comments, right now, before you know how this ends, have you ever had someone you trusted completely turn out to be capable of something you never could have predicted? My name is Camille. I was 39, and 6 years earlier, I had co-founded a specialty logistics consulting firm with a man named Julian, someone I'd known since business school, someone I trusted enough to walk away from a stable corporate job and put my entire savings into a company that, for most of those 6 years, genuinely felt like the best decision I'd ever made. We split everything 50-50 on paper, though in practice, the split had never felt even. Julian brought in the relationships. He was gifted at rooms, at handshakes, at making a client feel like the most important account in the building. I brought in the actual operation, the client delivery, the financial models, the systems that kept 40 employees paid on time, and every contract fulfilled to the letter. It worked, for a long time, the way partnerships work when both people are quietly relying on skills the other doesn't have, and neither one says the word quietly out loud. In the early years, that arrangement felt almost effortless. Julian would come back from a client dinner buzzing about a new contract, and I'd already have the delivery model roughed out before he finished describing it. We used to joke that between the two of us we made one reasonably complete business person, him all instinct and charm, me all structure and follow-through. I believed that joke for a long time. I think, looking back, I believed it a little too literally, in a way that let me stop paying close attention to things I should have kept watching. Over the past year, though, something had shifted that I hadn't fully let myself examine. Julian had become harder to reach. Meetings he used to loop me into started happening without me, with vague explanations afterward. Didn't want to waste your time on a scheduling call, or, it was really just a check-in, nothing you needed to see. Client calls I used to be copied on stopped showing up in my inbox. Twice I found out about decisions affecting our biggest account secondhand, through an operations coordinator who assumed I already knew. I noticed it in smaller ways too. A slight hesitation before he answered certain questions, a habit he'd never had before of glancing at his phone mid-conversation, like he was waiting on something more urgent than whatever we were discussing. None of it, on its own, meant anything. All of it together, looking back, meant almost everything. I brought it up with Julian directly, once, over a working lunch that I'd specifically requested. I feel like I'm finding out about things a step behind lately, I told him. Is something going on I should know about? He waved it off with the easy, warm confidence that had always been his best asset. Honestly, it's just been a lot of moving pieces on the Kessler account. Didn't want to loop you into every half-formed thought before there was anything real to share. You know I'd tell you if it mattered. I believed him. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I wasn't naive, and I wasn't inattentive. I noticed the pattern. I asked the question directly, and I accepted an answer that, in hindsight, was carefully engineered to sound exactly reassuring enough to make me stop asking. I was wrong to stop there, but I didn't understand how wrong until I was standing in a bank lobby holding a document with a signature that wasn't mine, attached to my name, on a piece of paper that had just erased 6 years of my life from the company I helped build. I found out entirely by accident, which is almost always how these things start. I'd gone to the bank that morning for something unrelated, a routine line of credit renewal tied to the business, paperwork I'd done a dozen times before without incident. The manager, a careful woman who clearly had no idea she was about to become the messenger for the worst afternoon of my year, pulled up our account and paused. I just need to confirm, you're aware of the ownership restructuring filed last month? I told her I wasn't aware of any restructuring. She turned her screen toward me and there it was, a shareholder resolution, dated 6 weeks earlier, transferring my full ownership stake to Julian for what the document listed as fair value consideration, already exchanged between the parties. A number I'd never received. A signature at the bottom that had my name typed beneath it, and a scrawled line above it that resembled my handwriting, the way a forgery always resembles the real thing. Close enough to pass a glance, wrong enough to make my stomach drop the moment I actually looked at it. Next to my forged signature was a notary stamp, a name I didn't recognize, a date I had no memory of. I asked the manager to print me a copy on the spot, and she hesitated, glancing at her screen like she wasn't sure whether that was something she was allowed to do given that the account technically no longer listed me as an owner. She printed it anyway, quietly, the kind of small kindness from a stranger you remember long after the actual crisis has passed. I left that bank lobby that day in a kind of fog I don't fully remember driving through. I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I trusted myself to pull onto the road, the printed document sitting on the passenger seat like something radioactive. I called Julian 4 times before he finally picked up, sounding, for the first time in 6 years, careful in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. "There's obviously been some kind of mix-up," he said. "Let me look into it and call you back. Julian, this says I signed away my entire stake in the company. I've never seen this document in my life. I hear you. I do. Let me just get the full picture before we jump to conclusions, okay? I'll call you tonight." Tonight, I repeated, mostly to make sure the word existed somewhere outside my own head. He never called back. Not that night. Not the next day. By the 3rd day, his assistant was telling me he was traveling and hard to reach, a phrase that, 6 years into knowing him, I had never once heard applied to Julian, who answered his phone during vacations, during his own wedding rehearsal, during almost anything short of a dead battery. That silence told me more than any document could have. People don't go quiet like that over a mix-up. They go quiet like that when they're buying time to figure out how much you actually know. I called a lawyer the following morning, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Teresa who specialized in business disputes, and who, within the first 10 minutes of our conversation, asked me the one question I hadn't thought to ask myself yet. "When you say you don't remember signing anything," she said, "do you remember ever being anywhere near a notary in the weeks before that date?" I genuinely didn't. I went home that night and pulled up my calendar for the entire month in question, cross-referencing every meeting, every trip, every ordinary Tuesday, looking for a gap that could have fit an appointment I had no memory of attending. There was one, a single afternoon, 6 weeks earlier, blocked off on my calendar as personal, out of office, an entry I hadn't made myself, sitting in a slot where I actually remembered being at my daughter's school for a parent conference that same afternoon, a conference I could prove with an email confirmation, a sign-in sheet, and a teacher who remembered me being there for a full 90 minutes. Whoever had scheduled that fake calendar block hadn't been trying to fool me. They'd been trying to fool a notary, or a record system, into believing an appointment had happened that never actually did. Teresa pulled the notary's registration records the next day. The name on the stamp belonged to a woman named Ferris, operating out of a shipping and notary storefront 2 towns over. Nowhere near our offices, nowhere I had ever, in 6 years, had a single reason to visit. I didn't recognize the address. I didn't recognize the strip mall it sat in. Nothing about it connected to any part of my ordinary life. "I need you to understand something," Teresa told me, sliding the registration printout across her desk. "A notary is legally required to witness the actual signing, in person, with valid ID. If you were never there, either this notary committed a serious crime, or someone impersonated you convincingly enough to pass for you. How does someone impersonate a signature well enough to fool a notary? They don't have to fool the notary on the signature itself," she said. Most notaries barely glance at how closely a signature matches anything. They're verifying identity through a presented ID, and confirming the person in front of them appears to be who the document says they are. If someone walked in with a convincing enough fake ID, or one that had simply been altered, most notaries wouldn't catch it in a 30-second interaction on a busy afternoon. That detail sat with me uncomfortably. It meant the fraud hadn't required forging my handwriting convincingly at all. It had only required convincing one distracted notary, for 30 seconds, in a strip mall I'd never been to, that the woman standing in front of her was me. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I kept coming back to one name, over and over, because it was the only name that made any sense at all. I want to be honest with you about who I blamed first, because it's the version of this story I was most certain of for almost 3 full weeks, and it wasn't Julian. It was his new executive assistant, a young, ambitious woman named Priyanka who had started 6 months earlier, right around the time meetings began quietly excluding me. She had access to Julian's calendar, access to company records, and, I told myself, building the case in my head late at night, an obvious motive to make herself indispensable to him by cleaning up whatever mess he needed cleaned. I spent almost 2 weeks quietly documenting every interaction I could remember having with her, convinced I was building toward the moment I'd finally confront the person actually responsible. I pulled up old email threads where she'd CC'd herself onto conversations she had no obvious reason to be part of. I remembered a conference room I'd walked past where she and Julian had gone quiet the moment they saw me through the glass. I built, in my head, an entire narrative of ambition and quiet maneuvering, and the worst part is how good it felt to have a name to attach all of it to. Suspicion, I learned, is its own kind of relief. It's easier to be angry at a specific person than to sit in the discomfort of not knowing. I was wrong, and the way I found out I was wrong is the part of this story I think about the most, because it came from the single detail I almost didn't bother checking. Teresa had requested the notary's physical logbook, the handwritten record every notary is legally required to keep, listing every signer's presented identification for every document notarized. Ferris, the notary, cooperated immediately once she understood the legal exposure she was suddenly facing. She hadn't known, she insisted, that anything was fraudulent. She'd simply notarized what she was told was a routine business document, for a woman who'd presented what looked, at a glance, like valid identification. The ID she'd recorded in her logbook wasn't mine. It wasn't Priyanka's either. It was Julian's older sister. Here's the piece that took me the longest to understand, because on the surface, it made no sense at all. Julian's sister, a woman named Renata who I'd met exactly twice at holiday parties over 6 years, had no obvious stake in our company, no title, no equity, nothing that would explain why she'd be the one sitting across from a notary pretending to be me. The answer, once Teresa and I finally pieced it together, had nothing to do with Renata wanting anything for herself. She'd simply agreed to help her brother with something he needed done quickly, quietly, and without leaving his own fingerprints anywhere near it. What Julian actually needed wasn't my ownership stake, not really. What he needed was full, unquestioned control over the company's accounts for exactly long enough to finish something he'd already started 8 months earlier and had been desperately trying to hide from me since. He had been quietly shopping our largest, most valuable contract, the one client relationship that made up nearly 40% of our annual revenue, to a competitor, negotiating a side arrangement that would move that entire account under a new entity he controlled alone, with none of the profit obligated to flow back through our shared partnership. He couldn't do that with me still sitting as an equal owner, with equal access to our financial records and equal signing authority on client contracts. He needed me gone from the paperwork, not fired, not bought out through a real negotiation I might contest or investigate, but erased quietly, through a document designed to look routine enough that nobody would look twice at it until it was already 6 weeks old and harder to unwind. Teresa found the actual side agreement eventually, buried in an email account Julian had set up under a variation of the company's name, discoverable only because his competitor's own legal team, moving faster than Julian expected, had already begun drafting transition paperwork that referenced our client by name. Once she had that draft in hand, the entire shape of his plan sat out in the open. He intended to complete the account transfer within days of the forged resolution taking effect, collect a substantial signing payment structured to avoid appearing as company revenue, and present the whole arrangement to me only once it was already irreversible, as a decision that had, on paper, required only his signature, because mine had already been quietly removed from the equation weeks earlier. The forged signature wasn't really about taking my stake in the company we'd built. It was about buying himself just enough uncontested authority to finish selling the best part of that company out from under both of us before I ever had a chance to stop him. 6 years of trust, reduced to a single tactical obstacle he needed cleared off a spreadsheet before a deadline only he knew existed. I sat with all of this for several days before deciding what to do next, and I want to be honest about the version of this I almost chose instead. Part of me wanted to go straight to Julian, alone, and simply confront him with what I now knew, watch his face when I said his sister's name, watch whatever composure he had left finally crack in front of me, the way I'd been imagining it would for weeks. I didn't do that. Teresa talked me out of it in about 4 sentences. "The moment you confront him privately," she said, "he has time to destroy whatever's left of the paper trail before we can formally document it. Right now, you have a forged document, a fraudulent notarization, and a false calendar entry. That's evidence. A private confrontation gives him nothing but a warning. I won't pretend that logic settled the anger immediately. There were nights that week where I sat in my kitchen well past midnight, rehearsing exactly what I'd say to him if I ever got the chance. The way you rehearse an argument you know you're never actually going to have. It felt almost cruel, having the evidence and not being allowed, strategically, to use it the way I wanted to, as a weapon, delivered directly, face to face. I had to remind myself, more than once, that the version of justice that actually worked wasn't the version that felt best in the moment. It was the slower, colder, more procedural version, built to survive scrutiny, instead of just satisfying an urge. So instead, we did something slower and far less satisfying in the moment, but much more effective in the end. Teresa filed for an emergency injunction, freezing all company accounts and contract transfers, citing the fraudulent ownership document as grounds, before Julian's competitor deal could actually close. She warned me the filing itself would likely tip him off that we knew far more than he expected, and that the days between filing and the actual hearing would be some of the hardest of the entire process, because I'd have to sit with the uncertainty of whether the freeze would hold, whether the judge would see it the way we did, whether 9 days would be fast enough to stop a deal that had already been months in motion. They were hard days. I went to work every morning and acted, as convincingly as I could manage, like nothing unusual was happening, because Teresa had also warned me that showing my hand too early, even to our own employees, could complicate the case if word reached Julian's side before the hearing. I have never been more grateful for a job that kept my hands busy than I was during those 9 days. The hearing happened 9 days later, in a courtroom smaller and far less dramatic than I'd built it up to be in my head over that agonizing week and a half. No jury, no gallery, just a judge, 2 sets of attorneys, a court reporter, and the particular fluorescent quiet of a weekday afternoon docket moving through its scheduled cases one at a time. Julian arrived with his own attorney, visibly composed, dressed the way he always dressed for anything important. The same easy confidence I used to find reassuring back when it was working in my favor instead of against me. He didn't look at me when he walked in. I noticed that. 6 years of partnership, and he couldn't hold eye contact for the length of a hallway. Teresa laid out the timeline methodically, without a hint of theater, because she'd told me beforehand that theater wasn't what won hearings like this one. Clean, boring, undeniable documentation was. She entered the notary's logbook into evidence, the handwritten line listing an ID that wasn't mine. She entered the school conference sign-in sheet, time-stamped, proving exactly where I'd been the afternoon I supposedly signed away my ownership stake, standing in a hallway making small talk with my daughter's teacher while, allegedly, I was also sitting in a strip mall notary's office 2 towns away. She entered phone records showing 3 calls between Julian and his sister in the 72 hours immediately surrounding the notarization date, calls that hadn't happened at any other point in the preceding 6 months. The judge asked Julian's attorney a single, simple question. Can your client explain how his client's signature appears notarized on a document, on a date his client can independently prove she was at her daughter's school conference, witnessed by an ID that belonged to someone else entirely? There was no good answer to that question. There was never going to be one. I watched something in Julian's face finally give way. Not dramatic, not shouting, just a quiet, total collapse of the composure he'd been wearing since the moment I first called him from that bank lobby. The injunction was granted. The competitor deal, which had been scheduled to close within the week, froze along with everything else. My ownership stake was formally restored, on the record, with the forged resolution voided entirely. I won't pretend to know every detail of what happened to Julian legally after that hearing. That part moved into territory between lawyers that I wasn't fully part of anymore. And honestly, by that point, I didn't need to be. I'd gotten what I actually came for, my name cleared on the record, and the sale that would have gutted our company stopped before it could ever close. What I do know is that Julian was removed from any operational authority over client accounts within the month, pending a full internal accounting review that Teresa insisted on as a condition of any settlement. The forensic accountant she brought in found 2 other smaller irregularities from earlier in the year, nothing on the scale of the forged resolution, but enough to confirm this hadn't been one desperate, isolated decision. It had been a pattern he'd been testing quietly for longer than I'd wanted to believe. The largest client, once they learned what had actually happened, through channels entirely outside my control, since the competitor's own legal team had apparently grown uneasy enough about the collapsing deal to ask pointed questions of their own, chose to stay with our company, specifically citing their relationship with me and my team as the reason. Their procurement director called me personally, which he had never once done in 6 years, just to say he was glad the account was staying where the actual work had always been done. I bought out Julian's remaining stake 6 weeks later, at a valuation his own forged document had ironically helped establish, in a negotiation that finally happened the way one should have happened from the beginning. In writing, with real signatures, witnessed by a notary I chose myself, in a room where I was actually present. Here's what actually stayed with me, more than the relief of winning that hearing. I spent 6 years assuming that a 50-50 partnership meant an equal partnership, without ever really testing what would happen if one of us decided the other one had become inconvenient. That assumption cost me almost 2 full months of genuine fear before I finally understood what I was actually looking at. I want to be honest about something else too. I got there by refusing to accept the vague version of events at every single step. The bank manager could have let a confused look pass for an answer. I asked again. Julian could have gotten away with silence if I'd simply waited politely for his call back. I called a lawyer instead. The notary logbook could have sat unrequested if I'd assumed my suspicion about Priyanka was close enough to the truth to stop looking further. I kept looking anyway. The person I suspected first turned out to have nothing to do with any of it. The person who actually helped commit the fraud wasn't even someone with a stake in the company. She was simply someone willing to help family, without fully understanding, or perhaps without fully wanting to understand, what she was actually helping conceal. I think about that more than almost anything else in this whole story. It would have been easier, in a strange way, if the person responsible had been someone I could dislike cleanly, a villain with an obvious motive of her own. Instead, I'm left with a much messier truth. Sometimes the person standing closest to the damage isn't driven by anything as clear as ambition or greed. Sometimes they're just someone who said yes to a favor for a brother, without asking enough questions about what that favor actually required of them. I don't know what happened to Renata after everything came out, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. My anger, by the end of all of it, had settled almost entirely on Julian, where it belonged from the start. She was a tool he used. He was the one who decided to use her. If there's one thing I'd tell you to hold on to from everything that happened to me, it's this: a forged signature, a missing calendar entry, a call that never gets returned. These are never random. They're always covering for something bigger than the document itself. Don't stop at the first explanation that's offered to you. Ask what the document was actually protecting someone from having to do in front of you. I still run the company. Smaller now, in some ways, We lost a few months of momentum we never fully got back, and I've had to rebuild a level of trust with employees who watched all of this unfold in real time, wondering, understandably, what it meant for their own jobs. But it's mine, fully, on paper and in practice, in a way it never quite was before, even in the years I thought Julian and I were equal partners. I sign my own documents now, in front of a notary I chose, in a room I'm actually standing in. It sounds like such a small thing to be grateful for. After everything, it isn't small to me at all. Did you suspect Julian from the very beginning, or did the assistant throw you off the way she threw me off? Tell me exactly where your guess started to shift. I read every single comment, and I promise you, this room is full of people who've had a signature, a document, or a quiet exclusion from a meeting turn out to mean something much bigger than it looked at first.